Hello and welcome viewers from all around the world. My name is Sultan Rabi'i, Research Assistant in the Economic Studies Department at Trends Research and Advisory, based in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. I am pleased to say that today I'll be the moderator of this promising economic E-Symposium, organized by Trends and titled Reopening of the National and Global Economies, Lessons Learned. Today, I have with me our honorable participating panelists, Mr. Simon Lacey, Senior Lecturer in International Trade, University of Adelaide, former Vice President, Government Affairs, Huawei Technologies in China. And we have Mr. Zhenhai Qiu, researcher from Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China, and Dr. Richard Woodward, Associate Professor in International Business, Coventry University, United Kingdom, and Dr. William White, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Senior Fellow, the C.D. Howe Institute, Canada, and Dr. Manal from the OIS KFAS Research Fellow, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Welcome all, and thank you for accepting Trends Research and Advisory invitation and joining and participating in the symposium. In this session, our panelists will shed light on the reopening of the world's economies, citing several examples from around the globe as we are facing a transitional period. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present, and I will inform the speaker 5 minutes ahead of the end of their time limit. The session will focus on the following themes. So Mr. Simon Lacey will talk about the threat of anti-globalization and moves against economic openness, current trends and lessons learned. And Mr. Zhenhai will speak about requirements for opening national economies, the economic policies perspective. And Dr. Richard Woodward would speak about the anti-globalist movement, dangerous but not deadly. And Dr. William White would speak about COVID-19 and the global economy, preconditions, and other threats to a sustainable recovery. And Dr. Manal, uneven path to reopening, insights from advanced and developing economies. So with that, I will leave you with our first speaker, Mr. Simon Lacey.
Thank you very much. So just bear with me as I try to share my screen with you. Can you all see that?
Yeah, we see it, Simon.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about, I just sort of give an introduction to the history of the anti-globalization movement and how it's sort of evolved over the last 2 decades. And really, I've sort of divided this lecture into sort of 6 parts. Organized mostly chronologically, and then at the end I'm going to talk about a little bit about COVID-19 and more about the challenges and opportunities that we now face. So let me get started going back to the 1990s. So I think the first thing to remember is that the antecedents to the current backlash against globalization can essentially be found starting sort of in the late 1980s, but predominantly in the 1990s and early 2000s, where, you know, if you recall, we had an unprecedented wave of trade and investment liberalization, starting perhaps in 1992 with events in the EU, such as the Treaty of Maastricht, the Agreement on the European Economic Area. Then in 1994, you had the coming into force of NAFTA, which was itself preceded by a lot of sort of soul searching in the United States as to the merits of the agreement, particularly from labor groups fearing low wage competition from Mexico. And then also in 1994, you had the Marrakesh Conference, and that led in 1995 to the establishment of the WTO. The 1990s were also characterized by increasing engagement with China, and sort of the back and forth in the Clinton administration on whether to make renewal of China's most favored nation status contingent on its human rights record. This is something that Clinton ultimately decided to abandon about 16 months into his tenure. And while all of this sort of closer economic cooperation, integration was taking place, a backlash was unfolding amongst anti-globalization in the anti-globalization movement, which really started to pick up momentum in the 1990s, bringing together representatives from the global labor movement, as well as disenfranchised farmers from both rich and poor economies, as well as environmentalists, and of course, your sort of run-of-the-mill anarchists. And these groups regularly demonstrated at events like the annual World Bank and IMF meetings, the World Economic Forum in Davos, and of course, very visibly on the streets of Seattle in 1999 as the WTO ministerial collapsed. So this was really at the height of the neoliberal Washington consensus. And although there seemed to be agreement on these values and principles in many capitals, the truth was and is that globalization produces both winners and losers, and governments have consistently underperformed when it comes to adopting and implementing effective policy solutions to address the concerns of the losers, those whose livelihoods are the most negatively impacted by globalization. So in addition to the efforts at closer economic integration that I've just described, you have to remember that the 1990s were also characterized by a series of monetary crises, starting in 1994 in Mexico. Then you had the Asian financial crisis, the Russian ruble crisis, 97, 98 respectively. And all of these sort of resulted in harsh austerity measures being imposed as IMF conditionalities, which tended to hit the poorest, hardest in these countries, and was really just more red meat for the anti-globalization movement, just poured more gasoline on the fire. So fast forward now to 2007, where a downturn in the US housing market sparks the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, which leads to a lot of instability in the US banking sector. So you have Bear Stearns ending up in the hands of JP Morgan, you have Merrill Lynch being purchased by Bank of America. But the decision to let Lehman Brothers fail really sparked off a collapse in confidence around the world and massive interventions by governments in many countries to bail out entire industries and sectors. And so you had this contagion between the financial sector and the real sector. And so you had companies like AIG and GM come into serious trouble. So in Europe, clouds had already been gathering in 2007 with the first bank run in 150 years in the UK as Northern Rock began to falter. And then the Lehman Brothers collapse set off a chain of events that saw the banking sector of Iceland stumble to the brink of insolvency, with similar repercussions felt in Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain in 2009. And the EU as a bloc entered into a long period of suppressed economic growth due to the austerity measures that had sort of been imposed on governments in order to recover from the European sovereign debt crisis. So the 2000s were really something of a lost decade for much of the West, with productivity growth never returning to pre-crisis levels, arguably because both the US and European economies lost a lot of productive capacity, which never really returned, such as people sort of exiting the labor force and never rejoining, or factories being shuttered and never reopening. On the other side of the world, however, in China, it was a very different story. And China, due to its exposure to international markets, had suffered some short-term hardship due to the collapse in demand that followed the GFC. But this was to a large extent mitigated by massive stimulus from the Chinese government. And it was in the 2010s that many Chinese exporting firms started to see huge gains in global market share. That's certainly the case with with Huawei, my former company. And Chinese outbound investment also grew to record highs in 2016, with the United States and Europe being the preferred destinations. It was also in the 2010s that China overtook Japan to become the world's second largest economy, and also overtook the US economy in purchasing power parity terms. That was in 2003, as well as becoming the world's largest trading nation also in 2013. So the 2010s, whereas it represented a lot of hardship for advanced industrialized countries, the 2010s, certainly the second half of the decade, were really the moment when one could say that China had really arrived. And this newfound status and a new and assertive leadership in China started to attract the ire of a newly elected US president. So the Brexit referendum in June 2016 and Trump's surprising election victory in November the same year were both really symptoms of the broader malaise affecting liberal democracies and global market capitalism in the second half of the 2010s. And they should both be seen as sort of protest votes by their respective electorates, which for 2 decades had experienced sort of a hollowing out of both the working and middle classes and stagnant wage growth, relative declines in the standard of living. Globalization was clearly not working to the benefit of all, and inequality was and still is at record highs in advanced industrialized countries. And so the contrast is very important. So in the 90s, you had this anti-globalization movement that really represented as fairly radical and militant sort of fringe movement. But by the second half of the 2010s, this feeling of resentment against globalization was something that was broadly shared. So Trump's ascendancy to the White House would also spell the end of efforts by America to demonstrate leadership in overseeing the global system of alliances it had built and nurtured since the end of the Second World War. And Trump has proven to be, a bit of a wrecking ball president and a very divisive figure, both at home and abroad. And that's as true today as it was in the 2016 election. So, by the end of 2019, after almost 18 months of very sort of punitive tariff war with China, confidence in the global economy was at historical lows. The IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, all predicting sluggish global economic growth in 2020. And that was due largely to the uncertainty that Trump's trade war with China had unleashed. So the world was already in a very tenuous, very precarious position at the end of 2019. And that was before COVID-19 hit. So as we're all aware, and nobody more so than in the United Arab Emirates, COVID-19 has been an unmitigated disaster for the global economy, unlike anything any of us have experienced in our lifetimes. And the truth is we're not yet out of the woods. So we're not likely to see a return to any kind of normality until we either discover a vaccine or until most of the world's population develops herd immunity. And that itself would require much higher rates of infection and recovery and inevitably mortality. So this is, as I said, this is without doubt been the greatest challenge many of us have ever faced. And the impact of the crisis and its effects are likely to be long lasting. But, where there is unprecedented hardship, there's also the opportunity to embrace radical change and reform, the likes of which would never have been politically palatable in less distressed times. And this is where I'll conclude this presentation with some words on what governments need to be thinking about as they prepare for the recovery. And I've really only got 4 points here. So number one is the long-term impact on labour markets. So the crisis has shown that governments have a role to play in cushioning the blow that comes from sudden and unexpected economic hardship, but that people also have a responsibility at an individual level to reskill and pivot and to embrace the new when this is called for. And I think this crisis will ultimately result in greater resilience on the part of workers, but governments, have to make sure that people can come out of this with their livelihoods and basic financial positions intact. Another long-term impact will be in the area of technology. And this crisis has shown how reliant we all are on online connectivity and the tools that allow us to stay connected, even if we can't physically travel. And I think this will ultimately lead to a re-emphasis on the need to invest in connectivity infrastructure, especially now as we are sort of at the dawn of a new generation of communication network technologies, 5G, which really promises to be revolutionary. Another long-term impact will be in the area of supply chain resilience as companies and governments develop so-called China Plus One strategies and consider reshoring what can be economically reshored and rebalancing or redistributing among different suppliers what can be. And so the almost mindless focus we've had on maximizing economic efficiency over the last 2 decades will be replaced by a greater emphasis on systemic resilience. And finally, and somewhat optimistically, I would think that as we come out of this crisis, this will bolster and give rise to a new era of international solidarity as we all come to realize that we all rise and fall together and our fates are all intrinsically intertwined. And this, of course, presupposes that we can get past the current tensions besetting relations between China and the United States, which has more to do with US presidential election politics than anything else. And I would hope that the world can emerge from this with a renewed sense of the importance of a rules-based international order, and the operative terms there being rules and order. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions either now or later via email. Many thanks, and please keep in touch.
What an amazing insight. Thank you, Mr. Simon, for enlightening us with regarding to this topic, and what an optimistic view. I really thank you. I know you have to leave. We'll receive the questions at the end. But, thank you so much for participating. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Happy to take any questions from the other panelists if there's time. I can stick around for a few minutes, but I leave it in your hands, moderator.
We have 4 minutes, yes, Mr. Simon. So if anyone wants to ask something to him, like right now, please feel free to do so.
I would say, one of the things that I was supposed to address was what are the dangers of closing markets. And, speaking from my personal experience at Huawei, we did see, while I was there, I joined Huawei in 2015. And while I was there, we really started to sort of fight a rearguard action on our market access and our freedom of action. And so one of the threats, I think, that you'll see, and one of the risks to closing markets is that, of course, it reduces efficiency, but it also reduces innovation. I mean, in what we've sort of come to see is the emergence of open innovation models, and we talk about global value chains, but they're also global innovation networks. And as markets close, you see sort of increasing system fragmentation, and that just raises compliance costs for companies, and it ultimately reduces innovation, and that has long-term kind of negative impacts on global welfare. So I think that would be something to highlight as one of the dangers of the path that we look like we might be heading down as markets close.
Okay, so I actually have a question for you, Mr. Simon, if you could answer it quickly. So will COVID-19 force global economies to implement more protectionist policies, and will this translate into an increase of custom fees?
Well, I mean, we have seen some kind of knee-jerk reactions in terms of closing markets, especially for things like masks and protective equipment, and also food, where countries felt that they were food insecure. And that's sort of those measures that the World Bank is tracking those measures together with the Global Trade Alert and the European University Institute. Those measures sort of peaked around March or April and have slowly been relenting. Look, I don't think we're going to see a return to the protectionism that we saw during the global financial crisis, but what we've really got to keep an eye on is the massive government interventions and stimulus. They can also be very market distorting, and they can have repercussions that are ultimately quite protectionist. So that's something that we need to kind of keep an eye on. But I don't think it'll play out in terms of customs duties, but it will play out in the sort of competitive environments and the level playing field dynamics that foreign firms are going to face vis-a-vis domestic firms on countries that have really employed massive stimulus packages.
I see. Well, that's an interesting point of view, and I'd like to thank you again, Mr. Simon, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Look forward to next year's meeting in Dubai.
Hopefully. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Simon.
Thank you.
And I think we have Dr. Sandrine. She joined us a little bit late, but hi, welcome. Sorry, I didn't say hi earlier. So Dr. Sandrine is actually the Deputy Head of Division at the OECD in France. Welcome. And with that, we will go with our second speaker, Mr. Genhai Q. And he will speak about the requirements for opening national economies, the economic policies and perspectives. Mr. Genhai? I think he's facing a little bit of trouble with the connection. We'll give him a few minutes. So I think he's facing a bit of trouble. I think maybe he could participate later. So we'll go to Dr. Richard, that he will speak about the anti-globalist movement, dangerous but not deadly.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the invite. In some respects, my presentation dovetails, I think, quite nicely with Simon. There's quite a bit of overlap, which I can now gleefully cut out and talk about other things instead. But I guess the general theme of what I was going to say is that the history of globalization is littered with examples where the process has slowed or gone into hibernation or even gone into reverse. But that shouldn't necessarily be mistaken for the death of globalization or the end of globalization. And the spectre that's often invoked, of course, when we talk about the end of globalization is the 1930s, where, you know, a decade of depression that was both a cause and consequence of the world's leading powers turning their backs on global integration really marked the end of the first era of globalization and hastened our descent into a worldwide war. And so it's unsurprising, I suppose, that lots of commentators are worried about history repeating itself. But I think the good news, and I share Simon's optimism here, is I don't think that this is the 1930s revisited. I think there are all kinds of reasons why the situation we face today is different, and why contemporary globalization is more robust than some of its predecessors or some of the examples of globalization from history. So as Simon has already said, you know, the obituary of globalization has been written a number of times over the last 30 years. So, you know, he mentioned Mexico, the Asian financial crisis, Seattle, the global financial crisis of 2008, Trump, and so on and so forth. But I think every time that its death has been announced, it's proven to be greatly exaggerated. Globalization has, if not come back stronger, then it has certainly survived and prospered. But I think there is a sense that, you know, somehow, you know, this time is different. And I know that's always a dangerous phrase to invoke. Anyone who's familiar with global financial markets, as soon as you hear those words, you should run for the hills. But But I think it is true to say that globalization over the last 10 years or so has spluttered and stalled. I wouldn't necessarily say it's gone into reverse, but there's certainly evidence that it has slowed down. So if we look at, you know, the amount of money that's flowing over national borders, it still hasn't got back to the peak that it reached in 2008. Shares of world trade as a share of global GDP, again, haven't reached the peak of 2008. We've seen multinationals possibly returning home and shortening their supply chains and so on. So I think that's one aspect of it. But I think the other thing that is, again, is worrying people is that some of the factors that sustained globalization in the past, again, have weakened. And I think there are two things in particular here that I would flag up. And again, Simon has touched on these. One is, again, about the winners and losers. And I'll say more about this in due course. But perhaps that over the last 10 years in particular, that globalization has created too many losers. And now we're seeing the political repercussions of that, not just in the rise of Trump, but around the world, the rise of populist leaders. And the worry is, of course, that technology, things like artificial intelligence and robotization and so on, might actually begin to make that worse as we go. And I think the other thing that, again, has perhaps been lacking, although I'm going to question this a little bit later on, is a lack of global leadership. In the sense that after 1945, you know, the United States was the undisputed hegemon. It was the preponderant power that acted, albeit sometimes reluctantly, as the global leader and the global policeman. And since 1945, it's really been the champion of globalization, you know, ushering in that rules-based liberal international economic order that Simon has mentioned. And I agree with him. I think this is a really important point. But two things have happened. Firstly, this changing center of economic gravity towards China and Asia might mean that the US is no longer able to play that role. It might be declining. That's an open question, I think. I think US decline is often overstated. But I think a more worrying sign is not just that the US perhaps isn't able to play that role, but it's no longer willing to fulfill that role in the way that it once did. And of course, the US is now headed by an administration which is actively repudiating many aspects of the liberal world order that it created, because it argues that this is facilitating the rise of our rivals, most notably China. They're free riding on the global public goods that we provide. And the result is that the US has started to disengage from these bodies to a greater or lesser extent. And it's probably best encapsulated by what we're seeing at the World Trade Organization, where, you know, the US's continual blocking of appointees to its appellate panel has now effectively paralyzed the dispute resolution mechanism. So I think there are reasons to be concerned. And against that background, you know, COVID-19, you know, a virus that emerges in a market in China and then proceeds to cause serious disruption to societies around the world. And we have those shortages of food and medicine. You know, the argument that countries would be better off reducing their dependence on trade and becoming more nationally self-reliant perhaps becomes a little bit more compelling. But I think that view, and it's quite a common one, I mean, I see it in the British and Irish press a lot. Okay, so only a couple of weeks ago, Adam Tooze in The Guardian, again, he was talking about the death of globalization, or the end of globalization. And I don't dismiss this out of hand, but I think it is a slightly one-eyed view of globalization and how the world looks. And I think there are three things in particular that I would flag up that are different now compared to the globalizations of the past, and certainly the globalization of the 1930s. I think the first thing is that modern globalization is quantitatively and qualitatively different to anything that's existed in the past. So even if you go back to 1970, trade as a proportion of global GDP was about 25%, give or take. Today, it's 60%. So even after a decade where trade has stalled and spluttered along, it's still far more important than it ever was. And likewise, I think the focus on trade, I understand why it's there, but to some extent, I think that misses the point that, you know, in the past, globalization was a lot about the movement of goods and services and the movements of money, but I think today it's about other things as well, particularly the movements of information over borders. And that's something that has grown exponentially over the last 15 years. I was amazed when I looked at this to find out that flows of information have increased 260-fold since 2004. Now, I'm not an expert on that, but I'll take those figures at face value. And I think the other thing here is that globalization today is embedded into the sort of the fabric of everyday life in a way that it hasn't been before. So it's embedded into the everyday lives of individuals. It's embedded into the business strategies of almost all of the multinational corporations. It's embedded into our national and international institutions. And I think particularly for individuals as much as anything, I think globalization now suffuses our everyday life, and it's altered our behaviors, our mental maps of the world about what is possible and about how we lead our life. And I think it's also made people realize how dependent they are on the global economy. And I was reading the other day the economic consequences of the peace while I was preparing for this. And I always think it's great to go back and look at the likes of Keynes and Smith and others, because I think they write so lucidly and clearly. But in that, of course, Keynes actually talks about the inhabitant of London, sitting, sipping tea in the bed in the morning, able to phone, and get everything ordered to his doorstep from there. But of course, back in 1919, when he was writing that was something that was only available to the elites. But today, I'm sure many people who are watching this, they've been ordering their food online, having it delivered to their doorstep. And when you investigate where that food comes from, it's from all over the world. So I think the costs of deglobalization are much greater than they were in previous eras. And I think that's one thing that is very, very different. The second thing that I think is a big difference, particularly with the 1930s, is that we do still have, for all its failings, a system of organized international economic cooperation, which barely existed at all back in the 1930s. Again, I think today, too many people almost take for granted that there is an IMF, a World Bank, a World Trade Organization, a G7, a G20, and I can see the OECD winking at me in the corner there in the background. But the fact that all these organizations exist, they didn't exist in the 1930s. In a way, they were a response to that crisis, a recognition that if you were going to have a liberal international economy, you had to have rules to govern it. And this also had to be embedded in a domestic context. You also had to give states the ability to protect their citizens from some of the more drastic effects of the international economy. And I think these organizations today do three key things for us. First of all, I think they're a kind of a palliative. And rather like globalization, I think the liberal international economic order has very deep roots. And by and large, the rules are followed. Okay, so people tend to seize on the moments when the rules are broken or disobeyed, but for the most part, the rules are followed. And even when they aren't followed, they tend to be acknowledged as legitimate. In other words, states acknowledge that the rules are there, even if they're going to break them. And I think that in itself is quite significant. And one of the things for me after 2008 that was really important is the global trading system didn't degenerate into a free-for-all. It could easily have done so, but I think an important reason why it didn't was the fact that we had a framework of rules and institutions that people could appeal to. Second thing I think these institutions do is they act as circuit breakers. They stop crises from escalating. So while there might be a public slanging match going on somewhere, quietly behind the scenes, the world's diplomats from these countries are slowly trying to broker deals. They're trying to find common positions. They're trying to resolve some of these tensions. And I often think here of the OECD in that regard, because that's where the institution that I have researched the most. And over the years, the OECD has done a fantastic job of quietly resolving disputes out of the public eye. So something that, there's a debate at the WTO that can't be resolved. Very often it will get decanted into the OECD, and it's happened at the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements. There's all kinds of examples. And I think the third thing about these organizations is they're more robust than many people give them credit for. They're not just artificers of US power. America is important, and I think if America turns its back on these institutions, they're likely to be less important and less effective. But I think they also reflect the negotiated outcomes of lots of other interests. In other words, these organizations are in the interests of a lot of other states, not just the United States. And so the US, I would prefer it to keep skin in the game. But if it doesn't, I don't necessarily think that that spells the death knell for all of those bodies.
So
and the third thing, five minutes, yeah.
You have 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes, perfect.
Yes.
So I think that the last thing, my third point really, is that the balance of winners and losers has changed. And I don't necessarily mean that there are more losers now or more winners now, but I think what has changed is where those losers and winners are. So since 1945, most of the primary winners from globalization were from the advanced industrialized North. And of course, that's not surprising because the advanced industrialized North set the rules and set the rules up in a way that disproportionately benefited them. And most of the opposition in that time came from the global South, the feeling that they were being left behind by globalization. But I think over the last 3 decades, that position has inverted. So as the global South opened up and multinationals started shifting their operations to emerging markets to take advantage of lower labor costs and to exploit these rapidly growing markets, increasingly, that's where the winners were located. In other words, it was the people of the global South now, particularly in East and Southeast Asia, who were the big winners. And now the big losers were in the advanced industrialized North. But I think importantly, it wasn't necessarily the poor of the advanced industrialized North that lost. It was actually the upper middle classes that lost the most. There's some very interesting research by Branko Milanovic, which shows that between 1988 and 2008, the biggest losers in the North were those between the 75th and the 90th percentiles of the global income distribution. So, and of course, these are the people who traditionally support globalization. They were the big beneficiaries in the past, and now they're the big losers. And the fact that you've got these winners in the South, I think globalization is finding new champions, okay, from those citizens and from those countries. So there was a YouGov poll published in 2016 that it asked people, has globalization been a force for good? And the France, the UK, and the US, these were the places where the fewest people agreed with that statement. 91% of people in Vietnam, on the other hand, thought that globalization had been a force for good. So as I say, globalization might be finding new champions. We famously had Xi Jinping at the World Economic Forum in 2017, indicating that China was now ready to defend globalization and assume that leadership mantle. Whether it will or not, I think is again an open debate. So what does all this mean? I'm conscious I must be almost out of time. So I think perhaps the Western dominated globalization of the past is perhaps coming.
Sorry, Dr. Richard, I'm really sorry, but I have to cut you off here.
That's fine.
What an interesting point of view. And I have to say that, unfortunately, we need to give each one of you like more time, but, with the time constraint, that's all the time we have. And I really think that you have some interesting point of views. And I have to say that I agree with you. And it shows us how globalization is actually resilient and integrated in our day-to-day life. And it will need some improvements and cooperation from all countries around the world to make it better in the future. So thank you, Dr. Richard.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll move to Mr. Jen Hai to start his presentation on the requirements for opening national economies, the economic policies perspective. Please, Mr. Jen Hai.
Hi, thank you. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Today, I want to be presentation is for the requirements for opening national economics and the economic policies perspectives. I focus on the provide the examples, financial globalization policies for opening countries, just like China. China continues to expand the reforms and opening up, and relevant economic policies are constantly adjusted. China's financial policies are consistent with China's reform and opening up process, and the different policies have been introduced at different stages to ensure the smooth progress of reform and opening up. We focus on the macroeconomic effects of financial policies throughout this phase. Since the beginning of the China's economy reforms in 1978, the first phase is from the 1978 to 1997. Marks an economy led by the growth and the reforms of state-owned enterprise, essentially just as SOE initials. The economy in the second phase is from 1998 to 2015, was driven by the investment in large and capital incentives enterprise, and which form that we call the heavy sectors. The heavy sector includes both the SOE, the state-owner enterprise, and private-owner enterprise, POEs. In recent years, from the 2016 to present, we have witnessed transitions to what the Chinese government calls a new normal economy. All three phases have been shaped by the particulars government policies. The financials, the policies in China as a set of the created policies, monetary policies, and the regulatory policies. The monetary policies in China has always aimed to control the money regulatory policies and the money supply and aggregate created even until today. The the policies in China plays an essential role in directions banks credits to different sectors or firms. Such policies consist of a number of administrative tools, such as loans, counters, as windows guidance to limit credits to specific sectors or industries. In the SOE-led economy, credit policies is crucial for the achieving balanced growth between the heavy and light sectors and between the investment and the consumption. For the investment-driven economies, monetary policies, coupled with credit policies, plays a crucial role in the promoting overall the economic growth through the investment in heavy sector. Monetary policies are particularly potent in combating the 2008 financial crisis in the short run, but with the cost of the high debt burden in the long run, just measured by the net GDP ratio. Most of the stimulus was channeled to real estate and infrastructure, which form a large portions of heavy sector. Since massive monetary stimulators in the 2009, the effectiveness of the monetary policies has been eclipsed by the rise of shadow banking due to lax regulatory policy. In recent years, since the 2016, there have been the improvement in coordination between the monetary and the regulatory policies within the framework of the macro prudential assignment. In particular, the Chinese government has placed a number of the unified rules on assigned management across different financial sectors, just like across the formal banking and the shadow banking. The impact of China's financial policies work through the transmissions channels different from those in developing economy. Banks' credits have always played special roles in promoting China economic growth. And the government has always given preference to credits to certain firms or industries. Although the preference has shifted through the different phases in the SOE-led economies, bank credits were directed to SOEs in both heavy and light sectors. As a result, SOEs, especially those in the light sectors, just suffered from the problems with the existing capacities and over leverage. Most of these SOEs were small and medium sized. In the late 1990s, reform will focus on the SOE by the reducing over capacities of small and medium sized SOEs. This movement is called in Chinese, grasp the large and let go of the small. Reforms in the bonds sectors also focus on the non-performing loans to SOEs with the over capacities. In the investment-driven economy, preferential credits were given to the heavy sector. During this phase, most of the industries in the heavy sectors were favored by the Chinese government as part of the government's industrialization policies to promote the heavy sector. The asymmetric credit allocate in favor of the heavy sector was exhibited during the stimulus period from the 2009 to 2010s, and the main consequence is overstock in the real estate. Over capacities in industry supporting the real estate and over leverage in both real and financial sectors. Reforms in this economy different from those in the SOE-led economy focus on the stocking the real estate. The leveraging over capacity from steels, cement, and glass, and leveraging the financial sector, where these reforms continue in the new normal economic. China faces new challenges. In particular, financial reforms have.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Janhai, but we can't hear you. Like, I think your mic is. Can you speak up a little bit, please? Because the voice, we can't hear you well. I think there's something wrong with the mic.
Oh, yes.
You could speak up, it's fine.
For example, you hear me?
If you could just raise your voice a little bit, yes, I think we will hear you.
Oh. For example, I don't hear you from you. Do you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. But if you could just raise your voice a little bit, that'll be better, please.
Oh, sorry, I can't hear from you.
If you could raise your voice, Mr. Janhai, just a little bit so we could hear you more clearer.
Oh, sorry. I can't hear from you.
Perfect. We can hear you. Please continue. I'm sorry for the interruption. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
No,
for example, the financial deleveraging that has reduced bank credits to now bank financial institutions and thus shadow banking loans to POEs. At the same time, the default rates of the POEs and therefore the systematic risks have increased. SOEs is in the upstream industries, however, have continued to receive the preferential credits and remain the upper productives and monopolistic. Implicit guarantees by local governments to such zone-based firms makes difficult the deleveraging of the corporate debts. I want to introduce where the policies is with the economic development at the same time and the step by steps. So on the July the 20th in the 2019, the Chinese government announced a series of measures to further open up China's financial markets and the financial service sectors to foreign investment and participations. Overall, the announced measures continue to of the trend of the gradual opening up of the China economy. The present significant business opportunities for the first is the foreign investors wish to access China's massive the financial markets. The second is the financial institutions that wish to enter and expand their presence in China's financial service sector. With the service, a growing list of the multinational companies and a burgeoning educated and tech-savvy middle class. So the measures will not only present new business opportunities for the foreign entities, they will also allow Chinese financial institutions to partner with and attract capital from the foreign investor in new and existing ways. So I will introduce the details if you're very interested for this. Because the first is a credit, the 11 the measures just like this, a credit rating agency. Just is open the door for the foreign country. According to the FSDC's the announcement, we are getting approved foreign investment entities to engage in the credit rating business in China. The Chinese financial regulators may permit them to provide credit rating on all types of the bonds in Chinese interbank bond market and the exchange trade bond market, including financial institution bonds, non-financial corporate bonds, structured products, and bonds issued by foreign entities. So by way of the background, China's bonds market is the third largest in the world. The CIM is another counters wholesale market for the institutional investor that is regulated by the National Association of Financial Market Institute Investor is the central government organization. With fall under the supervisions of China's central bank, the People's Bank of China, the central bank. The CIBM announced for the approximately 90% of the outstanding values and 80% of trading settlement of China overall bonds market. The exchange trade bond market is consistent in the Shanghai's stock exchange market, Shenzhen exchange market is retail oriented, accounting for around 10%. The Chinese overall bond market.
Sorry to interrupt, but you have 3 more minutes. If you could summarize, please.
Yes. So I just introduced about this measures. I want to show the central government how to open the door and further opening up for go ahead. And we believe that the globalization is the future. So I will introduce about where the next steps is for the Hainan. The Hainan Free Trade Port. The Chinese government on the July 1st, 2020, released the master plan for the policies and that would support the development of the Hainan Free Trade Port. The goal is to develop Hainan Island into a global significant free trade port by the 2050. Among the policies to be rolled out are those that properly would facilitate trade, liberalize investment, allow the capital to flow freely cross-border, provide a convenient transit for people, and provide for safe flow of debt. So the Chinese want to establish the global the free market, a global the free trade, international trade, a global the financial system, but we do not want to replace another country. Just want to provide another choice, just like this. So today we want to introduce the experience. Our experience is focused on how to design the policies and for your the national economic development, and what can the policies how to go ahead at the same times for the future and for the globalizations, just like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Janhai, for sharing this interesting perspective and how China and the USA dealt differently by forming different policies and offering different stimulus packages. With that, we'll move to the next speaker, which is Dr. Sandrine, and she'll talk about the importance of globalization for small and medium-sized enterprises.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen.
Sure, go ahead.
Can I share my screen?
Please.
Share screen. Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure being here and sharing some insight on the perspectives of the small and medium-sized enterprises. Why SMEs matters? It's because first of all, they are the backbone of our economy. SMEs, almost all firms are small and medium-sized enterprises. Micro enterprises, firms that employ between 0 and 9 employees, account for 90% of all enterprises. SMEs account for about half GDP in OECD countries and 2 out of 3 jobs in the era. They also play a key role in innovation activities. First, because they have a competitive advantage in developing some non-technological innovation, but also because they can play a role in niche markets to implement innovation that may not attract a market large enough to get interest of larger competitors. They also play a key role in building social cohesion of simply in a neighborhood. The SMEs attracted policy attention, increasing policy attention, because they face very specific barriers related to their size and the lack of scales in doing business. Typically, they face more difficulties in dealing with inefficient regulatory framework, in uneven market conditions, or poor infrastructure. They also struggle more in accessing strategic resources like finance, like skills, data, technology, networks that could help them doing business, innovate, and scale up. What we have seen with recent evidence is that this limitation may compound into lower productivity and in turn into lower wages. And actually on average, again in the OECD era, SMEs pay employees 20% less than large firms. Then how to reach scale without mass? There is 2 main approaches. One is about globalization and the other one is about digitalization. Globalization, the fragmentation of production along value chain, have created new opportunity for smaller actors, following firms, to integrate niche markets, specialized markets. It's also an opportunity to source these resources that they lack abroad. It's a way to access skills. It's a way also to benefit from the spillovers of multinational or foreign direct investment, or to access some supply chain finance. Digitalization on the other side, it's a way to reduce transaction costs, access to information, networking, access to partners, trading abroad. It's also a way to gain flexibility, reactivity, and to differentiate products. Basically, globalization and digitalization to some extent can work together in the sense that globalization creates room for specialization as well as digitalization. This is a space where the smaller enterprises can have a competitive advantage and play a role. But effectively, SMEs are primarily local actors. They are little engaged into trade. Here you have the share of SMEs in gross export. If you keep in mind this number, like SMEs account for half GDP, you can see here that the contribution to gross export is much smaller. That said, if we look at the same approach, but in terms of value-added exports, and taking into account that SMEs may be supplier of direct and often larger exporter, the picture is slightly different. The SMEs are much more engaged into global trade indirectly. And this has an impact on the way they can access markets, but also the way they can access resources, benefiting from the spillovers of global trade and FDI without having to incur the cost related to trade. How these spillovers can take place? First, between this buyer-supplier relationship with the international firms, between partnerships, R&D partnership, joint venture, or licensing agreement, between staff mobility, especially if workers move from the more productive firms to the local firms, or through market adjustment, driving by competition and imitation practices. Past evidence as well have shown that SMEs that are connected, that have linkages with multinational and can access financial resources could be more resilient in case of crisis. So what is the stage or the state of the global value chain? As it has been mentioned already, even before COVID, the GVC have started shortening. Here you can see on this chart the global import intensity of production, which is a sum of all trade of intermediary inputs in relation as a percentage of global output. And what you could see is clearly that since the beginning of the 2019, there is a clear break in the fragmentation of production. If we look at another indicator, which is a small chart, here you can see the global foreign direct investment flows in billion US dollar. And clearly again, there is a slowdown in international investment over the past years. There are several reasons beyond these trends, but overall what we can see is that there is a clear trend by multinational to rethink their optimization strategy and how they spread the supply chain worldwide. Part of this explanation are related to global trade tension and increase in trading costs and uncertainty, a change in consumer demand for more responsible business conduct and more sustainable production method, a change in business model with a closer to market and more reactive business model, and also the impact of digitalization. Because digitalization, let's take for instance the example of 3D printing. To some extent, the technology is not mature enough yet, but this is the technology that can completely change the rationale for offshoring, encouraging multinational to move from this market thinking or efficiency thinking strategy to a strategy to access knowledge, to access digital infrastructure, or to access digital assets. So these different trends combined are weakening the rationale for maintaining and handling these long and complex global value chains. So now, how have FDI and global trade been affected by the COVID? Badly. First, if you look on the left-hand side, the FDI flows, you can see that following this slowdown that I mentioned earlier, there is a clear break, a very clear fall beginning of 2020. And here you can see on these two charts different scenarios, optimistic or less optimistic, more pessimistic scenario. And in both charts, it's the same story that even in a case of optimistic scenario, which means that the public measure for the public health measure and public economic measure works, FDI flow will not recover before 2021. And in the most pessimistic scenarios, they will remain well below the pre-crisis level. For global trade, the pictures are more or less the same. The scenarios are different in the sense that it's more like the single hit and double hit scenario. Single hit scenario, it's what we have lived now. So double hit scenario is the case of a return of infection and then a return of lockdown worldwide. So what is the situation for SMEs? SMEs have been hit hard, extremely hard. First, for structural reasons, the sense that I mentioned before, it's that they are overrepresented in the most affected sector. Consumer-focused services, retail trade, construction, professional and personal services. So there has been a joint survey conducted by the OECD, Facebook, and the World Bank around to 30,000 business owners, managers, and employees. And they found out that 26% of businesses were at complete standstill during the lockdown. I just open a parenthesis here to show you how these closure rates can vary across country. 26% business being closed during the crisis, it's an average. And it ranks from an 8% in Germany to 58 or 43% in Ireland and UK. So basically, these very different closure rates depend on the stringency of measure, but as well some structural feature of the economy. Among the businesses, the small businesses that have succeeded to remain open, over 50% declare a decline in revenue of more than 50%, and a third had to reduce their workforce. If you look at the proportion of SMEs still operating that declared a decline in sales, 70% in Middle East, North Africa reported a drop in revenue to 61%, for instance, in Europe. Again, we have looked at more than 40 business surveys conducted around the world, and the same message is emerging. More than 50% of SMEs are at risk of being out of business in less than 3 months. All is related actually to the problem of liquidity shortage. In this context, governments have reacted quickly and strongly. First, they are focused on the measurement issues, the health issues, sorry, raising information and sharing information with SMEs. And then they have addressed directly the liquidity, short-term liquidity issue by deferring payment of taxes, grants, utilities, but also by opening new credit lines, new loans guarantee, or providing SMEs with grants and wage subsidies. I must say that we have seen a large variation across country of the way government have reacted, but the first similarity is this one, this sequencing of measures. One other similarity we can find is the speed of reaction. They have been extremely rapid, quick to react. And then it's the scale of reaction. It's an unprecedented scale. The amount of public money that have been invested to support SMEs, to rescue SMEs, goes much well beyond what has been seen in recovery package during the financial crisis.
Sorry to interrupt, Doctor, but you have 3 minutes. If you could summarize. Yeah, thank you.
And then I come to the fourth step, it's about structural policy. It's the fourth step because government needs to turn to a more longer terms and structural policy and find the way to exit this crisis management phase to enter into a phase of recovery, reconstruction. These crises have highlighted that SMEs are not just vulnerable. They have entrepreneurial capacity, innovation capacity. We have seen many SMEs that have been able from one day to another to change business model, to implement digital tools. So there is a capacity, there is a potential. And one of the axes for this long-term approach, some countries have intensified export support for SMEs and for diversifying markets. There are several approaches. Some would have expanded existing mechanism, existing promotion activities. For instance, providing firms with new visibility solution. Some have developed emergency packages. Some have expanded the credit guarantee and credit insurance. But now the question is, what's come next? The future of GVC is highly uncertain. This has been mentioned already. But the reopening of global economy can help firms and places recover faster. As for the question we could have, what will be the next internationalization strategy? Multinational regions, countries are likely to rethink the way they design the strategy in order to increase resilience and independence in strategic era. Will it be by reshoring or will it be by diversifying suppliers? There is also a high likelihood that demand may become more made local, and user and customer asking for more for local product and services, which in turn will require firms to increase the flexibility of their local production? What are the limitations of reshoring and diversification? Because it may not be the most efficient solution, if possible at all, especially if firms require knowledge, technology, and skills that are not available locally, at least on the short term. And then there is a need to develop the risk management and resilience strategy among firms, including SMEs. And this is with needs for government to help reduce the asymmetry of information, especially when the global chain is.
One minute, doctor. Sorry, I know.
And if I can use my last 1 minute, I will wrap up. So what I want to highlight 4 points. SME are the backbone of our economy. They represent 2 out of 3 jobs in the OECD era, but they have been severely hit by the crisis, with serious concern about the survival of many, but also some insight on the entrepreneurial capacity of many others. Globalization could bring some solution, could open opportunity to access markets and resources and help them overcome the size limitation. But the global value chain expansion has stopped, and foreign direct investment and global trade have collapsed dramatically during the crisis. Governments have been extremely proactive in addressing the short-term liquid shortages and cushioning the layoff. But there is an exit to the crisis management to find, and in order to shed the foundation of the recovery. GVC can be an option, can be a solution, can help firms and places recover faster, but there is a high level of uncertainty, and government can play a role in enabling SMEs to enter and participate in SMEs.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Sandrine, for shedding light on SMEs. I didn't know how important they were until your presentation. So thank you for that. And with that, I'd say we'd move to the next speaker, which is Dr. William White. And he will talk about COVID-19 and the global economy, preconditions and other threats to a sustainable recovery. Please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Doctor. Yes.
You can hear me? Okay,
yes,
super.
We can.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the recovery of the global economy from the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of us want a fast and sustainable recovery. I guess what I'm going to emphasize most is the various factors that I think are going to act as headwinds against that particular outcome. I think we're going to face a lot of very difficult circumstances, and not just in the SME area going forward. And what that leads me to the conclusion, that in a certain sense, we're going to have a total reset going forward. The situation from an economic, financial, social, political, and perhaps above all, environmental, the situation is unsustainable. We are on a path that is not a good path, and we need really a total reset. Now, let me say a few words about various aspects of that. Why do I think there are all these headwinds for sustainable sustainable recovery? I guess the first thing, it's a bit like an individual patient going into the hospital with COVID-19. The ones that are dying are the ones with preconditions. And the sadness of it is that the global economy had a lot of preconditions going into the pandemic. It was, in fact, a kind of accident waiting to happen. COVID was the trigger, but it honestly could have been anything else. Now, what are these preconditions? I think the most important ones really have to do with debt. The fact of the matter is that really since the late 1980s, monetary policy has been the weapon of choice whenever there's been a downturn, after actual or incipient. And the problem with the use of monetary policy, and I say we used it in 1987, in 1990, in 1997, 2001, 2007, time after time, You use monetary easing to deal with downturns, but you never tighten as much as you eased. And so the upshot has been a constant ratcheting down of interest rates. And at the same time, because the lower interest rates are designed to encourage people to spend more, increases in debt. And so when you look at what has happened over the course of the last 30 years, there's been a constant upward ratcheting of debt levels. So the latest numbers I can recall from the Institute for International Finance is that global debt ratios, that's debt to GNP, was about 320% at the end of 2019. And that compares with about 280% when the crisis started in 2008. So for people who think, well, crises are periods of deleveraging, think again, because that's absolutely the opposite of what has just happened. So debt is a kind of headwind. If you bring your spending forward today because the interest rates are low and build up debts, then that's money you spent today you can't spend tomorrow. So that is a real problem. And it's not the only side effect, as it were, of these monetary policies. One of the other important side effects is the impact on financial institutions. My own personal belief is that monetary policy has done more to create financial instability than stability. And you can see it at the level of the financial institutions where the lending margins have been squeezed and squeezed. The pension funds, the insurance companies are all in really big trouble. The banks increasingly are recognizing that they've got a problem too as the margins are coming down. And it's not just the financial institutions, it's the financial markets. We have seen increasing evidence of illiquidity in financial markets. We have seen asset prices, both real and financial, bid up to levels that are totally unsustainable. So there's a lot of problems out there on the financial side. And my sense of it in terms of headwinds or preconditions is that we have got some serious issues out there to deal with. And if monetary policy is a problem going forward, continuing to do what we've been doing, I would have to say fiscal policy is not much better. And fiscal policy has actually been doing exactly the same thing for the last 30 years, that we always ease, mostly automatic stabilizers, but also discretionary easing during the downturns. And that we never tighten as much in the upturns as is required to stabilize the debt to G&E ratio, the sovereign debt to G&E ratio. So they just keep ratcheting it up over and over with time. And so we're now in a situation where these numbers, the overhang of sovereign debt is as big as it's ever been outside of a wartime. And when you add in all the contingent liabilities, using this kind of Larry Kotlikoff intertemporal accounting stuff, you get to numbers of sovereign debt to GDP ratios that are 300, 400% of GDP. So these two are unsustainable. So we've got some big problems here in terms of headwinds. Well, that's my first point. My second point is even worse than the first point, which is those are not the only impediments to growth going forward. I can't remember whether it was Richard or Simon talking about the virus. For those who sort of believe that short of a vaccine, we're going to herd immunity, okay? Not as a target, but as something that's inevitable, okay? If you believe that, then this second wave, third wave, fourth wave thing is going to be out there for a very long period of time with all of the implications. Now, there's all sorts of ways we could go into that you can mitigate the damage, but there's another sort of problem. I think when we look at supply side developments, looking at the longer term prospects for the economy, again, you can see a number of problems that have been building up. One of them is the demographics, okay? We've gone through the last 20 or 30 years, some combination of the baby boomers in the advanced markets and the re-entry of China and India, huge increase in the labor supply, That's all finished. I mean, in China, in Japan, all of the more developed emerging markets, to say nothing of the advanced markets, that demographic thing is now going into reverse. So instead of having rapidly increasing labor supply, we're going to have a rapidly decreasing labor supply. And that, of course, is going to weigh on growth going forward. The problem of digitalization is also something I think we have to worry about. It's been mentioned before. It could be an important impediment to job growth on the one hand, although on the other hand, it should, we hope, increase total factor productivity. But again, some of these developments on the supply side that are not going to be helpful. International trade, I hope that those of you who speak optimistically about globalization are right, but I'm not so sure. And to the extent that global trade does slow down, it will bring with it all of the bad news that has already been mentioned. Global warming, unambiguously negative. It is going to cost a lot of money to adapt. Okay, I'll get into mitigation in a moment. It's going to take a lot of money to adapt. And that is going to imply serious resource constraints going forward. So there's a lot of things that are holding back growth. My contention would be that we do need a total reset with respect to a lot of different things, economic, environmental, political. First question you have to ask yourself is, what would the new economy look like? Okay, if we're going to say we don't want to continue doing what we're doing, we want to go to a different place, what would that different place look like? I guess the first thing that I would say with respect to a sustainable economy is that we need a sustainable financial system. And I'm not just saying this because this program is coming out of the Gulf. I think we need a wholesale embrace of Islamic finance. The way in which the Western economies in particular have relied on debt has got to stop. We have to rely much more on equity going forward and on risk sharing. And I think that's a very important point. I think the governments and the central banks have got to start following much more symmetrical monetary and fiscal policies. We can't just always ease. We have to tighten when the opportunities are there to do so. I think on the real side of the economy, obviously we've got to deal with the environmental thing. That's going to be number one. I think that's going to involve carbon taxes. I think we're going to have a change from shareholder value to stakeholder value. I think we're going to have much more vigorous enforcement of antitrust rules. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to have to be done going forward. I won't have time to get into the political stuff, but the political stuff is as frightening as the economic stuff, frankly. So even if you know where you want to go, how are you going to get there from here? That's the next question. Because we are where we are, and we may have a vision of where we want to go, but we are where we are. So what's going to have to happen in order to get to where we want to go? I think the first thing that we have to do is we need a change in the mindset. There's too many people out there in too many disciplines acting as silos, thinking that their system, above all the economic system, is actually sort of simple and static in time. You know, the economic models are all of that nature. The world is not like that. The world is complex, it's adaptive, and there's a whole science out there of complex adaptive systems that the economists and many others need to sign on to. So first, getting there from here needs a change in the analytical mindset. Financial system, there's going to have to be an awful lot of debt written off. Much of it is unsustainable at anything like normal interest rates. So we better go back and start looking at our sort of debt reduction facilities. Are our bankruptcy and insolvency and restructuring facilities up to it? Sandrine probably knows that the OECD has been doing an awful lot of work on this. And their conclusion is that in most countries, restructuring is not fit, the legislation is not fit for purpose. On the production system side, as I mentioned before, I think we're going to have to go to a carbon tax, and probably a big one. And I would also add in, there's going to be huge costs associated with stranded assets. I'm sure that people in the Gulf have been thinking about this for quite some period of time. Mark Carney pointed out the implications for the financial system. All of that stuff is going to have to be dealt with. And lastly, and I didn't mention this before, the basic institutional structure we've got. You know, I think it was you, Richard, who was sort of saying you've got a lot of faith in the institutional structure. I was writing down everything that you said because I need more good news in my mindset. I do worry that the current institutional structure is not really fit for purpose, that we've got all of this new global, post-war global stuff, but it's not operating in the way that it should. And I've been in the trenches for 40 years, and maybe I can just sort of see the warts too clearly. But I think we need much more powerful supranational organizations, and we don't have them. And I think we also need much more reliance on local stuff, you know, where people that really understand the local problems, and they can so that if the global institutions set the vision, the local institutions can make that vision happen. Okay, we need a kind of barbell strategy, but we're miles away from it. So we're in a bad place. We need to go to a different place, and there's ways in which we can get there. If we do decide, and I think this is likely, no, all of this stuff is too costly, and therefore it's totally unpalatable. And therefore, all the governments and the central banks decide it's business as usual. Then I think we're going to have a real problem. And I think there's a reasonable chance that that's what's going to happen, you know, that it will be. People will double down. One reason is because I think we're going to have a disinflationary environment for the next couple of years. And the central banks and the fiscal authorities will basically go back to the old weapons, whether they work or not. And they'll get solace from the modern monetary theory people who basically say to them, there's nothing to worry about. Debt is not a problem.
Dr. William, 2 minutes.
Sorry, and I'll finish up on this. And for those who do worry about debt being a problem, they're going to get solace from people who talk about the prospects for financial repression, you know, that you somehow stimulate growth, but you keep the interest rates down so that the debt service requirement gradually ratchets down over time, which is what happened at the end of World War II. So all of these people will be providing solace to those who have a natural tendency to double down. Because if they don't double down, they're actually accusing themselves of having policies in the past that were more of a problem than a solution. So I think that's what will happen. And it might work, the doubling down. I'm not saying it's impossible. It might just work. I don't think it's very likely, because the world today, you know, when you think about financial repression, for example, capital control, stopping money flowing from A to B, much harder to do in the modern world. So it could work, but I don't think it's very likely. And if it doesn't work, then what you will get, okay, and probably in a highly nonlinear way, is you will get very high inflation and perhaps even hyperinflation, because that's what's always come out of fiscal dominance abetted by the central bank. So maybe doubling down will get us out of it. Probably it won't, and we'll have a problem even worse than the problem I've already described. So I guess my conclusion, I'm with John Kenneth Galbraith, who once said, politics is not about the art of the possible. It's about choosing between the unpalatable and the disastrous. So my advice is, if you want to avoid the disastrous, we have to accept the unpalatable.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. William. You actually covered a lot of ground. And you have an interesting point of view. All of you guys do. And, sorry to interrupt you, but, we have this time limit. And
Yeah,
hopefully,
I'm sorry, and I went on too long as it was.
no, it's fine. All of you guys have interesting point of views, even Dr. Richard Woodward, and hopefully at the end, we'll have an open discussion. Hopefully you guys could add some stuff there if we have time. And with that, we'll move to our last speaker, which is Dr. Manal Shihabi, and she'll talk about uneven paths to reopening, insights from advanced and developing economies.
Thank you very much. I'm just about to share my screen now.
Sure.
Can you see it?
We can't, Doctor.
Oh, okay, here we go. All right, you should be able to see it now.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think my presentation very nicely piggybacks on both Sandrine's and William's presentations. So I'll be basically trying to offer a little bit more details on the national and opening national economies, but with more insights of advanced versus developing economies. In terms of just a caveat, obviously this is a high-level discussion. The list is not exhaustive by any chance. Just for facilitating the discussion in what advanced economies versus emerging and developing, I kind of followed, the rough, the IMF, I guess, classifications. But I'd like to particularly also focus on resource exporting economies with a little bit more detail. And obviously, everything in this presentation is my views and based on my research. This slide here kind of covers the three main points of my presentation. So the first one is that obviously when we reopen the economy, it's going to be a balancing act between what's happening on the health side, but also what's happening on the economy, because we know the coronavirus is still going. In terms of, and then I want to talk about how and what the challenges that could be occurring or facing governments when they consider different paths of reopening the economy, and how that would basically mean different paths and different speeds for developing versus advanced economies. And then finally, so what, why does this matter? And the real point there is basically that the takeaways I want you to have from this presentation, which I'll say right now, is that we're looking really at basically making sure that whatever the short-term goals that we're looking at achieving are not going to be necessarily at the expense of long-term goals. And there are a lot of challenges and opportunities that I'll cover very quickly, but I'm also ending on a positive note as well, is that there is still a possible opportunity for comprehensive reform as well. To go to the first point of the balancing act, obviously I'm not going to go into the details of this. This information is available in public, but when we examine what the spread of the virus, obviously, and the number of cases and increases, that will determine the speed by which an economy often is reopening. And you'll see that with the exception of the United States, as in the highest number of cases in the world, we see that pretty much developing countries are now really catching up in the speed of the cumulative number of cases and across regions. And then if I look at this slightly more detail, just in the last 14 days, we see pretty much the same thing. So the darker the color, this is from the ECDC, the darker the color is the higher number of cases per 100,000 of citizens. And we also see large spread, continuous and increasing in developing economies, not only in developed. So when we look at how are we going to reopen the economy, obviously COVID-19 wasn't just one shock. It affected the economy in multiple different shocks at multiple levels. But what it really did is that it exacerbated existing economic challenges in developing economies, definitely in oil exporters. And you see that, they had higher levels of poverty or inequality, the debt level that William mentioned, also higher levels of reliance on fossil fuels. There's lots of different structural imbalances and economic distortions. You see that particularly in labor markets, but also more importantly in oil or in resource exporting economies. we not only had the shock of, or the shocks, let me say, that accompanied COVID-19 and the lockdown, but you also had unprecedented decline in resource prices. So that's from coffee all the way to oil. So what that meant is the economic contraction that already existed was exacerbated by that cost. So what we're going to see is that there are going to be more grave effects of COVID-19 in developing economies than in advanced economies. The second point of the presentation is basically on just different paths of reopening national economies. I will not cover, I've listed them, I think these are maybe generally the three basic models, which I will not discuss, but places like New Zealand could kind of have a control of the pandemic and then full reopening of the economy, or more gradual, like what I think is happening in the UK, with you also still have restrictions on maybe travelers with quarantines or vulnerable populations, or more gradual phased approach. I think going forward, the phased approach is probably what's going to be more dominant, but that's still going to be a balancing act of the extent to which an economy can manage existing outbreaks in the future, of course, but also how bad COVID-19 was to the economy and any national economy, in the sense like, do we need to open it now versus not? And of course, how much funds there are available to stimulate the economy, whether from local sources or from borrowing. In terms of managing current and expected outbreaks, I think this will depend on what an economy or government would think that they can access vaccine in the future, how ready their public sector is, or public healthcare system is, and of course, finally, social distancing. I'll skip the point on vaccine because that's, I think, quite straightforward, but the healthcare system readiness is where we see a great disparity, obviously, between developing and advanced economies. Inability of testing or isolating hospital beds, but also, I think, really importantly, offering protective measures for healthcare workers. And how possible is it to isolate different vulnerable populations? And that will be very important because, we're really looking at lives versus lives here, in the sense of we need to protect people from getting infected from COVID, but also we need to reopen the economy to protect and safeguard livelihood. And this, the WHO in Africa, for example, had warned that if the pandemic isn't controlled, we're looking at over 190,000 deaths over the next year. So, whenever we reopen the economy, obviously, how we can manage the falling cases have to be an issue. Then, of course, social distancing. And here, how can we manage social distancing? We have populations that are highly dense, and sometimes regions within countries that are very highly dense. Then you also have in many, you see this in developing economies, larger households, the demographics are different. Maybe they have to rely on public transportation that are very crowded. And then you also have informal sectors and market, and this is very specific for developing economies because it's really hard to control them. So we'll have to think then when we reopen, what would be easy measures to kind of control if we don't have social distancing, masks and whatnot. I'll skip this, but basically the point here is population density is more relevant within country rather than across country, because even some developing countries like Japan or Korea can be more dense, but they manage to control, while in Brazil, obviously, it's not the issue, but it's within country that is going to be important. I'm cognizant of time, so let me talk about how the extent to which the effects of the pandemic obviously will affect reopening of the economy. To moderate the effects of the pandemic on the economy will happen through basically how we reopen. A lot of the reopening, as you all know, has been telecommuting heavy, working from home, but also ability to support businesses. And here again, we see massive discrepancies between advanced and underdeveloped or developing economies. Obviously, technological digitization infrastructure is important. If you have, one computer per household versus multiple, it affects the ability of people to work and learn at the same time. Sandrine's mentioned a lot of the support for small SMEs and small industries in general, but also the ability of to be able to go and for industries to export. And developing economies, definitely in oil exporting economies, you see there's high dependence on imports, definitely for final, but definitely intermediate goods. That makes it a bit difficult also to start just expanding the export-oriented sectors. And then finally, in developing countries, you have large populations that are just really hard for them to telecommute. And of course, as we said, social distance. In terms of availability of funds, I think in the world it's been economic stimulus packages have kind of been the main way of supporting firms and citizens, but in the fiscal effect has been large in all economies, but the fiscal space is more constrained in developing economies and also in oil exporting economies. And that's where variations of taxation system, how much funds are set aside for supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. Of course, in oil exporters, I've mentioned the collapse, or in resource exporters in general, the collapse of export revenue through the collapse of the price. And then what we also see is that there's been large expansion of government expenditures, which has been funded from borrowing. So we're becoming, we're solving a short-term problem with a long-term problem, but also large withdrawals from sovereign wealth funds, which have been massive and problematic even for large sovereign wealth funds like Norway and Kuwait, etc. And also reallocation of funds from development projects to awards funding stimulus packages. So you can start seeing where I'm heading, I think, with this here as well. And this is where I'm heading into why the fact that we will have uneven paths in recovery then matter, because obviously how we reopen the economy now is going to be very important to the economic recovery post-pandemic. And there's, as I said, it's important to protect citizens' lives, but also their livelihood through work and opening the economy, but also balancing the short-term development need of the fact that we really need to support populations and reopen the economy with how that affects long-term development. Particularly, I find a concern is that a lot of the economic stimuli packages have been funded through basically, as I mentioned, borrowing, but also drawing money away from development projects, but also energy transition projects. And even just the fact of reopening the economy by itself is not going to be sufficient to reverse the economic negative effects of COVID-19 on national economies. So what that means is we have to find multiple solutions and then just open the economy and proceeding. And definitely for developing world, because we're finding large effects on inequality and poverty as well. One thing I'd like to mention is a lot of the economic consultant work that's been out there about funding recovery has been really encouraging the return or the importance of the return of the consumer. And I think that's perhaps more appropriate for advanced economies than developing economies, in part because developing economies, we've mentioned the differences of labor. For example, they already have larger poor populations who are not basically going to be able to fund or support a lot of consumption, but also because consumption, economic stimuli that expand consumption have been shown to also have negative effects or increase global greenhouse emissions and also exacerbate existing distortions in the economy. So there is then an opportunity here for policy to be innovative and to think of not just reopening, but also long-term resource and economic sustainability. Finally, well, not finally yet, but in terms of, I just want to touch very quickly on energy transition. I won't go into this in much detail, but I think the effects of the COVID-19 and reopening the economy will have also different effects on energy transition in advanced economies, where it's been shown that there's an increased share of expenditures on clean energy. I think that will not be the case, at least immediately, in most developing countries, because they tend to rely on fossil fuels in general, but also because even things like green policy packages, which have been shown to increase or boost economic growth and help the climate at the same time, they're politically contentious because they compete with welfare distributive measures. So that these, from a political perspective, these will be difficult to apply in a lot of developing economies. And this is definitely the case for oil exporting economies. This is basically from a paper that's forthcoming in soon in Energy and Resource Economics, where basically I highlight the fact that a lot of the current addressing short-term economic problems within oil exporting economies is really at the expense of long-term goals, particularly for not just energy transition, but also for economic diversification, and also for continuous reliance on welfare distributive measures and the role of the private sector. And also in terms of changes of fiscal policy, it's really difficult to add new taxes and even carbon taxes when you have an economy that's contracted by multiple shocks. Yes, 3 minutes. That should be good. And here I want to take the opportunity to just kind of give some lessons and really opportunities for opening national economy. This is, I think, really fundamentally a public health issue. So the masks have been socially not acceptable in many places. That will need to be changed. I think also in terms of the developing countries having informal sectors, there's also very important, I think, opportunities in terms of grassroots and citizen-led support group, things like digital payments that could pass a lot of funds for them. And then also for government-driven development, the opportunity here is to start engaging more the private sector for not only employment, but also increasing competition, and also working with governments on green energy packages. I think it will be really important to start shifting support from consumption to workers and producers, and even doing a gradual work with low to medium transmission risk industries first. And then finally, I think it will be important to have within the expanding welfare expansion something that's a little bit green. So we support, for example, the subsidies for green technology, perhaps, and maybe we cut subsidies from other things that are non-essential and high carbon emitting for high income households. The conclusion from this is here. We do have large trade-offs, as you've seen, or I hope I've convinced you that there are. And reopening the economy by itself is not going to be sufficient. And this is where it will be really important to apply comprehensive reform. Things William mentioned, carbon taxes, applying those in ways that can achieve double dividends. So you have multiple positive effects on the economy and reducing distortions at the same time, but also different macroeconomic and energy policy that even within the existing problems now, we can improve slightly the efficiency of an economy. And here's an example. This is my last slide. Here's an example of a study that I did that just came out in the Institute paper, looking at, this is from the case of Kuwait. If we just basically regulate oligopolies, we'll find that the economy will become much better at tolerating the shocks, like oil price shocks that happen after COVID. And so sometimes it's little, I shouldn't say little, they're difficult and big, but policies that actually fix a lot of the underlying distortions, so to speak, to improve economic response to that. And that was in response to GDP, and this is to welfare. And on that, I will be very happy to address any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And we actually received a lot of questions from YouTube and the email. And actually, I have a couple of interesting questions, and I would like to give each one of you the chance. Unfortunately, because of the time constraint, I'll have to limit that time for like 1.5 minutes for each, or 1 minute. So the first question, and this is for all of you guys and anyone who wants to answer. And I'll after the Q&A, we'll give you like each a minute to conclude or give one sentence. Thank you, Dr. Manal. If you could just close the presentation, please. You're good, it's fine. Thank you. Okay, so the first question is, will COVID lead to a collapse in capitalism? And this is open for all the panelists. Dr. William?
I would just make the point that both the capitalist model and the democratic model are significantly threatened, and were being significantly threatened before the crisis hit. And I think the crisis is going to make those challenges even greater than they were previously. So far from it was a book at the end of history, you know, the triumph of capitalism and democracy. We're far from that, and I think if we do wish to maintain either of those models or both of those models, the kind of changes that I was talking about, which are really quite fundamental, and I go along with those that Dr. Shihabi is talking about, those things will really be required. It is existential in a certain way.
Okay.
I think it depends what you mean here by capitalism as well. I think if you're talking about the more free market oriented form of capitalism that we've become familiar with, particularly since 1990, then yes, I see that very much as under threat. But if you're talking about models of state capitalism, that might be the coming thing, I guess. And that's what I had in mind at the end of my presentation, really, about if the rules governing international commerce change because rising powers determine that they want those rules to look different, that might advance that process.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
For better or for worse.
The second question. So this is a question actually about could international agreements on digital taxes help to reduce government deficits? I think Dr. William had something to do with taxes. So if you'd receive this question, Doctor.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, there's a real sort of lacune, where taxes are not being paid that ought to be paid by a lot of different actors, and certainly the digital part of it is an important part of it. But there's lots of other people out there as well who, even down to the level of individuals and tax havens and all the rest of it, that the OECD has been worried about for a long period of time. So all of that stuff should be exploited. I think a carbon tax could go a long way in many countries to providing the finance that's required to do many of the things that we wish to do. And there are other taxes too that it's not so hard to envisage. Property is something that I think has received too little attention in recent years. That's nothing new. That goes back to calls for higher taxes on land back in the 19th century. So
that's an interesting point of view. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Richard, if you want to add something to it.
Well, something that did go very, very quiet were proposals for a financial transactions tax, the so-called Tobin tax. I mean, I don't know what happened to that. It was one of the things, when I was starting out in my research career, this was a very active topic. I think in a way it almost got superseded to some extent by the focus on tax avoidance and evasion. I think it almost pushed it out of the equation. But it still seems to me that even a small tax on cross-border short-term financial transactions would yield you billions and billions in revenue. You'd then have other problems about how you would allocate it, and where the tax would be levied and all those kinds of, would it be a genuinely global agreement? Because you could have centers that decide they're not going to levy that tax. And then, of course, it just becomes a possibility for arbitrage. But it does seem to me to be something that perhaps ought to be looked at again. And I'm surprised, particularly in the context of high government debts, that it's something that seems to have vanished off the agenda.
If I can kind of comment on that as well, is that I think it's obviously there's a lot of asymmetry in information when we talk about taxes of multinationals, because you have tax authorities wanting to get their fair share, but then they also worry about operations and capital perhaps fleeing, but also very difficult sometimes. A lot of if you don't have a really well established taxation system, then you're going to have a very difficult way of monitoring firms. Basically revenue or capital and however then you'll basically be able to implement taxes on them that all governments in the world through OECD, for example, have to agree with you, right? So there's lots of, I think, challenges there at the organizational level, at the government level, and then of course you see it at the firms level.
Interesting. And there's actually a question for Mr. John Hai. And it's about the new economic stimulus measures that could be what new economic stimulus measures could be introduced if there is a second wave of the virus and no vaccine is discovered?
Actually about the measures is for the opening the economics is I think is involve the whole the financial the policies, and you need to provide a different level and step by step based on your location, the situation, different country and the different situation. So you must step by step. What's the first? What's the first? The goal, the second goal, the third goal. You must step by step. So actually, the Chinese experience told us about the Chinese the financial policies. Just step by step is directly and directly connect the global financial system, and to open about the monetary ratios, and you know they exchange the freely in the different like free trade port, free trade decision area, and we step by step, because we can to handle about this trend, the financial globalization. So we want to tell the whole world we need to get the multiple connections with a different country, different level, and for the different financial system, we can to accept about this side by side the different regionals, different policies we can to accept. So one barrel and the road just like a strategy. So we do not to establish the one world, one system, not one world, one system. It's a one world and multiple systems. Just like
nice. That's an interesting point of view. And there's actually this question for Dr. Sandrine, and it's about how to make SMEs survive this crisis. I know it's a very broad question, Doctor, but it's from the viewers.
It's a very broad question.
Yes.
I think, but what government did was a strategy to land first and check later. And it was the only solution to help these SMEs to survive the shock, the crisis. But then the next step is probably to insert some conditionality in public support. The question is when and how. It's also to reinforce the structural approach that I mentioned, structural policy, to help SMEs transform their business model, integrate the digitalization. It's also required investment in cybersecurity, because if you push all these firms to move to the digital world without preparation, it could be a major global risk. It's also a matter of helping them become more active, going more global and interacting on international market. So how to help SMEs survive? SMEs have a potential. The SMEs that don't have the potential will probably disappear on the market, and it's this creative destruction that will enable a reallocation of resources to more efficient firms. But there are many viable firms that will need this push to survive the transition. Now, for government, it's a very huge challenge, because we have mentioned many different things, many different policy domains, many different instruments. And as Manal mentioned, we need a comprehensive approach. We also need to reinforce the connection with the regions and the cities, because they may be called to play a key role in the transition, may be called to play a key role to support the local SMEs, because they know them better, they know the local market better, and the ecosystem better. We also need more evidence and data, because when I talk about SMEs, I'm just surfacing the issue. This is a very large and very heterogeneous population, and we need more to know about how different firms in different sectors behave and what they need. So basically, it's a challenge for government. It's also a challenge for international organizations because it's an unprecedented situation. And we have to react at a speed that is also without precedent.
I see. Thank you, Dr. Sandrine. And we have this last question that is for Dr. William and Dr. Richard. It says, would current crisis redefine globalization terms and conditions to be based on fair trade and integration, not exploitation?
Well, I think the problem is that this is where the pitiless truths of global politics come in, that the rules are always made and policed by the powerful. And of course, they tend to design those rules in a way that, at least to some extent, benefits themselves at the expense of others. So I don't think it matters too much which country or group of countries or group of interests is in charge. I don't think you're ever likely to get a truly just global system that's going to end inequality. I just don't really see that as a possibility, not in the immediate term anyway.
I see. What about you, Dr. William? What do you think?
I guess when we get to the question of international order, that's fair and just. I think maybe Richard was sort of alluding to this. There's a lot of many countries have different ideas coming out of their history about what order means, and so trying to get some agreement on that will be extremely difficult. And to say you're back into the mill of grinding out legislation and agreements that will eventually be based on political compromises, and at the end it'll be hard to see that it's how can I say, unambiguously just and fair in the way that we would like. I think at the national levels, even before we get to international trade, you know, the attention that governments have paid to those left behind, and not just by globalization, but by technological change, you know, that absence of attention in many countries, not least the United States, has been shameful, frankly. And I think all of that has to change. And it has to change not only because it's a just thing to do, but because if we don't get that change towards more inclusiveness, as the OECD would put it, then you're on the road to revolution. And I'm not quite sure that that's the path that we want to go down.
What an interesting point of view, Doctor. I'd like to just state that if you guys have any final words, please, like in a sentence, each of you. Anyone wants to add something? Okay, so just let me say what an amazing symposium. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your knowledge and experiences. Thank you, viewers, for watching, and thanks for the team at Trends Research and Advisory that made this event possible. Also, please be sure to watch our last event in the economic series called The Future of Global Economy, Growth and Challenges and Risks of Depression. What a humbling experience. Thank you all again, and I hope you guys have a nice day.